Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. So this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still getting a kick out of it every time I see my former HOA president walking her little dog past my house. She won't even make eye contact anymore, which is honestly the cherry on top of this whole mess. Let me start from the beginning. My wife and I bought our house 3 years ago in what I thought was a pretty reasonable suburban neighborhood. It's one of those developments where all the houses look slightly different, but you can tell they were all built by the same company around the same time. We specifically chose what the realtor called an edge lot because it gave us a bit more space and privacy. Our property is a little unique compared to the other houses on the street. When the original developer laid out the lots, our house ended up with this extra piece of land that extends closer to the street. There's a paved area that looks almost like a little parking cutout or apron. When we first moved in, our neighbors mentioned that previous owners sometimes let people park there during block parties or big events, but our deed clearly shows it's part of our property. We had a full land survey done during the buying process, so I knew exactly where our boundaries were. The HOA seemed pretty low-key at first. Monthly dues weren't too bad, they kept the common areas maintained, and mostly stayed out of everyone's business. The president back then was this older guy who had been doing it for years and seemed to understand that nobody really wanted drama. Everything changed about a year and a half ago when he moved to Arizona, and the board had to elect a new president. That's when we got stuck with President Miller. And let me tell you, this woman took the job like she was running for mayor of a small city. President Miller is one of those people who clearly peaked in high school as student council president and has been trying to recapture that feeling of authority ever since. She's probably in her early 60s, retired from some middle management position, and treats the HOA like it's her personal fiefdom. Within 6 months of taking over, she had implemented new rules about garbage can placement, started sending violation notices for things like having your porch light out for more than 48 hours, and began holding monthly community improvement meetings that were really just her lecturing everyone about property values. The real trouble started about 8 months ago when President Miller announced the Neighborhood Beautification Project. Now, I'm all for making the place look nice, but this thing was her personal crusade. She convinced the board to approve removing about 12 street parking spots throughout the development to install these elaborate flower bed displays. Don't get me wrong, the flower beds look fine, but the parking situation became a nightmare almost immediately. Our neighborhood was designed with the assumption that most houses would use their driveways and maybe need 1 or 2 street spots for guests. When you suddenly remove a dozen spots in a development with about 40 houses, the math just doesn't work anymore. People started getting creative about parking. Suddenly everyone was squeezing cars into every possible space, parking partially on grass, and fighting over the remaining street spots. It was especially bad during weekends when families had visitors or during any kind of neighborhood event. I didn't think too much about it at first because we've always just parked in our own driveway, and the little paved area on our property had mostly been sitting empty. My wife occasionally parked her car there when she was unloading groceries or when we had friends over, but it wasn't something we used regularly. That changed on a Tuesday evening in late spring. I was coming home from work, probably around 6:30, and as I turned onto our street, I noticed something weird. There were these professional-looking signs installed right on the edge of my property, bright white signs with blue lettering that said, "Guest parking only, 2-hour limit." I pulled into my driveway and walked over to get a closer look. These weren't some cheap plastic signs someone had stuck in the ground. They were mounted on proper metal posts, clearly professionally installed. The posts were sunk deep into what was definitely my property, right next to the paved area. My first thought was that maybe the city had put them up for some reason, or possibly that there had been some kind of mistake about property boundaries. I walked around the signs, took some pictures with my phone, and then went inside to dig out our property survey documents. After comparing the survey to where the signs were installed, there was no question about it. These signs were at least 3 feet onto my property, marking my land as community parking. I figured it had to be some kind of honest mistake, so I decided to bring it up at the next HOA meeting. These meetings happen once a month in the community center, and usually about half the residents show up to discuss whatever minor issue President Miller has decided needs community input. The meeting was that Thursday evening, and I brought my property survey documents along with photos of the signs. When President Miller asked if there was any new business to discuss, I raised my hand and explained the situation. "Hi, I just wanted to bring up something that I think might be a mistake," I said, standing up so everyone could hear me clearly. "Someone installed guest parking signs on my property this week, and I wanted to make sure the board knew about it so we can get it sorted out." I expected President Miller to look surprised, maybe apologize for the confusion, and promise to look into it. Instead, she barely looked up from her notepad. "Oh, that's part of the parking solution we discussed last month," she said dismissively. "With the beautification project, we needed to identify additional guest parking areas. Your driveway extension wasn't being used anyway." I blinked a couple of times, not quite believing what I was hearing. "I'm sorry, but that's actually my property. I have the survey documents right here if you want to see them." "OP," President Miller said, using that tone that people use when they're talking to a child who doesn't understand something obvious. "This is about the greater good of the community. You're not even using that space most of the time. We can't have people being not in my backyard about every little thing." A few other residents were nodding along, which honestly shocked me. I looked around the room and realized that most of these people were probably dealing with their own parking headaches and saw my unused paved area as a solution to their problems. "But it's literally my property," I said, holding up the survey documents. "I own it. It's on my deed." "We'll take that under advisement," President Miller said in a way that made it clear the discussion was over. "Is there any other new business?" I sat there for the rest of the meeting completely stunned. I had expected a simple misunderstanding to be cleared up in about 30 seconds, and instead I was being told that the HOA had unilaterally decided to convert part of my property into community parking for the greater good. After the meeting, a couple of neighbors came up to me. Most of them were apologetic, but explained that they were really struggling with the parking situation since the beautification project. One guy mentioned that his elderly parents had stopped visiting because they couldn't find parking close enough to the house. I understood their frustration, I really did, but that didn't change the fact that the solution couldn't be just taking someone else's property. When I got home that night, I told my wife what had happened. She was even more shocked than I was. "They can't just decide your land belongs to the community now," she said. "That's not how property ownership works." "That's exactly what I thought," I replied. "But apparently President Miller has decided that property rights are less important than convenience." Over the next week, I started paying more attention to what was happening with those parking signs. Sure enough, people were using the space. Not constantly, but regularly enough that there were cars parked on my property most days. The thing that really got to me was that these weren't just neighbors who were apologetic about the situation. These were people who clearly believed they had every right to park there. One morning I was getting my mail, and this woman I'd never seen before was getting out of her car right on my property. "Excuse me," I said politely. "I think you might not realize this, but you're actually parked on private property." She looked at me like I was crazy. "No, this is guest parking. It says so right on the sign." "Well, the sign is wrong," I explained. "This is actually my property. I live right here." I pointed to my house, which was literally 15 feet away. "Look, I don't know what your problem is," she said, grabbing her purse and starting to walk away. "But the HOA newsletter said this was community overflow parking. Maybe you should take it up with them instead of harassing people." That's when I realized this wasn't just President Miller being dismissive at a meeting. The HOA was actively telling people that my property was available for community use. I went inside and dug up the last few HOA newsletters. Sure enough, buried in the back of the most recent one was a section about new parking solutions that mentioned additional guest overflow areas throughout the neighborhood, including the space on our street. They weren't just putting up signs and hoping for the best. They were actively promoting my property as community parking. That weekend, I decided it was time to make this official. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, had it notarized, and sent it via certified mail. The letter was pretty straightforward. I included copies of my property survey, photos of the signs installed on my land, and a clear request that the signs be removed within 10 days. I made sure to keep the tone professional and factual. I wasn't trying to be threatening or dramatic, just wanted to establish a clear paper trail that showed I had attempted to resolve this reasonably. 2 weeks went by with no response to my letter. I checked with the post office and confirmed that the certified mail had been delivered and signed for. Then I got something I definitely wasn't expecting. A courtesy violation notice from the HOA. The notice claimed that I had unsightly landscaping and debris visible from the street and that this was negatively impacting neighborhood property values. The debris they were referring to was my car, parked on my own property. I read through the violation notice 3 times before I fully understood what they were doing. By parking my own car on my own property, I was supposedly creating a violation because it interfered with their designated guest parking area. It was so brazenly ridiculous that I actually started laughing. My wife found me sitting at the kitchen table with the violation notice, chuckling to myself. "What's so funny about a violation notice?" she asked. "They're trying to fine me for parking on my own property," I said, handing her the paper. "Apparently my car is unsightly debris when it's parked on land that they've decided belongs to the community." She read through the notice and shook her head. "This is insane. What are you going to do?" I'm not sure yet, I said, but I'm definitely not paying a fine for using my own driveway. The situation escalated over the next few weeks. More and more people were parking on my property, clearly believing it was legitimate community space. The worst incident happened on a Saturday afternoon when this massive SUV parked right on the edge of my lawn, leaking oil onto the grass. When I went out to ask the owner to move their vehicle, they became immediately defensive. The HOA newsletter said this is community overflow parking, the guy said, pointing to his oil-stained SUV. I'm not doing anything wrong. Look, I understand the confusion, I replied, but this is actually private property. That sign was put up without permission, and the HOA doesn't have any right to designate my land as community parking. Yeah, right, he laughed. You're just trying to hog all the good parking spots. Get over yourself. He walked away and left his leaking SUV sitting on my property for the rest of the day. That evening, I sat down and really thought about what was happening here. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The HOA had taken my property without permission, was actively promoting it as community space, and was now trying to fine me for objecting to the arrangement. President Miller wasn't going to back down because she'd already committed to this course of action publicly. She'd told the entire neighborhood that the parking problem was solved, and admitting she'd made a mistake would undermine her authority. The other residents weren't going to support me because they were benefiting from the situation. Free parking was more important to them than property rights, especially when it wasn't their property being taken. I realized that being reasonable and polite wasn't going to work. If they wanted to play hardball with property rights, then I needed to show them exactly what property rights actually meant. I spent the next week doing research and making preparations. First, I contacted a local towing company and explained the situation. The owner was this gruff older guy who'd clearly dealt with similar property disputes before. Happens more often than you'd think, he said. HOAs get a little power and suddenly think they own everything in the neighborhood. You want to set up a standing towing agreement? What does that involve? I asked. Simple contract that gives us permission to remove any unauthorized vehicles from your property. You just call us when you want cars towed, we come out and handle it. Property owner doesn't pay anything. All costs get charged to the vehicle owner. That sounded perfect. We set up the agreement and he explained the legal requirements. I needed to post proper signage giving notice that unauthorized vehicles would be towed. The signs had to be a certain size and placed in visible locations. I ordered small but legally compliant, private property, unauthorized vehicles will be towed signs and installed them around the perimeter of the disputed area. They were small enough that most people wouldn't notice them unless they were specifically looking, but large enough to meet the legal requirements. I also installed a high-definition security camera in a weatherproof housing that I disguised as a decorative birdhouse. The camera had motion activation and night vision, so it would capture clear footage of anyone parking on my property. Finally, I did some research on HOA liability and property law. What I found was very interesting. When an HOA misrepresents property boundaries or claims authority over land they don't control, they can be held liable for any damages or conflicts that result from that misrepresentation. Everything was in place. Now I just needed the right opportunity. That opportunity came about 2 weeks later when President Miller announced the annual summer community celebration in the next HOA newsletter. This was going to be the biggest neighborhood event of the year, with a potluck dinner, live music, and activities for kids. The newsletter specifically mentioned that parking would be limited and encouraged residents to make use of all available guest overflow areas, including the designated spaces throughout the neighborhood. I knew that meant my property was going to be packed with cars. The event was scheduled for a Saturday evening in early August. I spent that morning making sure everything was ready. Camera positioned properly, towing company on standby, and all my documentation organized. The community celebration started at 5 p.m. in the park area at the center of the development. By 6:30, my property was completely full. I counted 12 cars parked on my land, including President Miller's white Lexus sedan positioned right next to one of the guest parking only signs. I waited until about 8 p.m. when I figured most people would be settled in and enjoying the event. Then I called the towing company. This is OP. We talked about setting up the standing agreement for unauthorized vehicle removal. I've got 12 cars on my property right now. 12? The guy sounded impressed. That's a pretty good haul. We'll have 3 trucks out there in about 20 minutes. I positioned myself on my front porch where I could watch the action but stay out of the way. My wife came outside with 2 glasses of lemonade and settled into the other porch chair. You really think this is going to work? She asked. We're about to find out, I said. The first tow truck arrived at 8:15 p.m. It was one of those flatbed trucks that can handle just about any vehicle. 2 more trucks showed up within the next 10 minutes. What happened next was honestly beautiful to watch. These guys were clearly experienced and efficient. They worked methodically, starting with the cars that were easiest to access and working their way through the line. Each truck could handle multiple cars, and they moved like a well-coordinated machine. Hook up a car, load it on the truck, move to the next one. No wasted motion, no unnecessary delays. The whole thing took about 45 minutes. By 9 p.m., the area that had been packed with 12 cars was completely empty except for the guest parking only signs, which now looked pretty ridiculous standing in an empty space. My wife and I were still sitting on the porch, sipping our lemonade and watching the last tow truck drive away when we heard shouting coming from the direction of the park. Someone had apparently walked back to their car to get something and discovered that the entire guest parking area was empty. Over the next few minutes, more and more people started showing up to look for their cars. Small groups of confused and increasingly angry neighbors wandered around the empty space, checking and rechecking the area like their vehicles might be hiding somewhere. President Miller arrived with a group of other board members around 9:15 p.m. She was clearly furious, marching across my lawn toward the front porch. "What did you do?" she demanded, pointing at the empty space. "Where are all the cars?" I took a slow sip of my lemonade and looked at her calmly. "I had them towed," I said. "They were parked on private property without permission." "You can't do that," she shouted. "Those people parked there in good faith. The HOA designated that as community parking." "The HOA doesn't have the authority to designate my property as anything," I replied. "I sent you a certified letter explaining that 2 months ago. You chose to ignore it." One of the other board members, a guy I recognized but had never actually spoken to, stepped forward. "Look, this is clearly a misunderstanding that got out of hand," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "Can't we just work something out? Those people are going to have to pay hundreds of dollars to get their cars back." I stood up and walked into the house. A minute later, I came back out with a manila folder containing all my documentation. "Here's my property survey," I said, handing President Miller the folder. "Here's the certified letter I sent to the board 2 months ago requesting that you remove the unauthorized signs from my property. Here's the HOA violation notice you sent me for parking my own car on my own land. And here's the contact information for the towing company. They only accept cash." President Miller flipped through the documents, her face getting redder with each page. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're going to destroy neighborhood relationships over a parking space." "I'm not the one who destroyed anything," I replied. "You put signs on my property without permission, ignored my request to remove them, and then fined me for objecting. You told the entire neighborhood that my land was community property. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." "We'll see what our lawyer says about this," President Miller said, waving the folder at me. "Good idea," I said. "Make sure you ask your lawyer about HOA liability for misrepresenting property boundaries. I think you'll find the conversation very educational." The group of board members huddled together for a few minutes, whispering among themselves. Meanwhile, more angry residents were showing up looking for their cars. "Where exactly were they towed to?" asked one woman who had been frantically searching the empty area. "The address is in that folder," I said, pointing to President Miller. "About 15 miles from here. They're open until midnight for vehicle pickup." 15 miles? Another guy shouted. "How are we supposed to get there? Most of us came here with the people whose cars got towed." That was actually something I hadn't thought about. A lot of the neighbors had carpooled to the community event, so the people who needed to retrieve their cars didn't have transportation to get to the towing lot. I watched President Miller trying to organize carpools and coordinate rides while fielding increasingly angry questions from people who were just learning that their cars had been towed. The whole community celebration was effectively over as everyone tried to figure out how to deal with the car situation. My wife and I finished our lemonade and headed inside around 10 p.m. Through the front window, we could see people still standing around the empty parking area, talking on their phones and pointing at the guest parking only signs. The next morning, I found 3 separate violation notices stuck to my front door. Apparently, I was being cited for disrupting community events, failure to act in good faith toward neighbors, and behavior detrimental to neighborhood harmony. Each violation came with a fine. The total was about $800. I took pictures of all 3 notices and added them to my growing folder of documentation. Then I called a lawyer. The attorney I spoke with specialized in property law and HOA disputes. After I explained the situation and emailed him copies of all my documentation, he called me back within a few hours. "This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen," he said. "The HOA has no legal authority to designate private property as community space. By putting up signs and actively promoting your property as guest parking, they've created liability for themselves." "What kind of liability?" I asked. "Well, they've essentially committed fraud by misrepresenting property ownership to the community. Anyone who got towed could potentially sue the HOA for their costs since they parked there based on false information provided by the board. That was interesting. I asked him about the violation notices I'd received. "Those are completely unenforceable," he said. "You can't be fined for protecting your own property rights. In fact, I'd recommend sending a demand letter to the board requiring them to remove the signs and pay for any damages to your property." We drafted a letter together that was a lot more formal and threatening than my original certified mail attempt. This one mentioned potential lawsuits, liability issues, and demanded compensation for property damage and legal costs. The letter was delivered on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I got a call from someone who identified himself as the HOA's attorney. "I represent the Homeowners Association," he said. "I understand there's been a dispute about parking signs on your property." "That's one way to put it," I said. "My clients would like to resolve this matter without further escalation. Would you be willing to accept the removal of the signs and a written agreement that the HOA will not claim any authority over your property in the future?" "What about the violation notices and fines?" I asked. "Those would be rescinded," he said quickly. "And what about compensation for property damage and legal costs?" There was a pause. "What sort of damages are we talking about?" I had prepared for this question. The oil stain from the leaking SUV had required professional cleaning. The lawn had been damaged by people walking and parking on it. I'd paid for a lawyer consultation, security camera equipment, and proper signage. "About $1,500 in total," I said. Another pause. "Let me discuss this with my clients and get back to you." He called back the next day with a settlement offer. The HOA would pay for sign removal, property damage, legal costs, and agree in writing that they had no authority over my property. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue any further legal action. It seemed reasonable, so I accepted. 2 weeks later, a crew came out and removed all the guest parking only signs. They also installed a small decorative fence along the property line to clearly mark the boundary between my land and the community area. The HOA sent me a check for the agreed-upon amount, along with a written apology and acknowledgement that the signs had been installed without proper authority. But the best part came at the next monthly HOA meeting. President Miller announced her resignation. "Due to personal commitments and changing priorities," she said, reading from a prepared statement, "I will be stepping down as president effective immediately." Everyone knew what had really happened. The other board members had clearly decided that her handling of the parking situation was a liability they couldn't afford. The new president is a guy who works in insurance and has a much more cautious approach to HOA authority. One of his first actions was implementing a new policy requiring board approval and legal review before making any changes that might affect property boundaries or individual homeowner rights. Now, when I walk through the neighborhood, I get very different reactions from people. President Miller won't even look in my direction when she's walking her dog. The board members nod politely, but keep conversations brief and superficial. Most of the regular neighbors seemed to respect what I did, even if they were initially inconvenienced by the towing. I think a lot of people realized that if the HOA could arbitrarily claim authority over my property, they could do the same thing to anyone. The parking situation in the neighborhood actually got resolved a few months later when the board negotiated with the city to create additional street parking in a different area that didn't require taking anyone's private property. As for my property, I ended up paving the area where the unofficial parking had been happening and turned it into an extended driveway. It looks much better than it did before, and there's no question about who owns it. The whole experience taught me a lot about how power works in these small community organizations. President Miller wasn't necessarily a bad person, but she got caught up in the authority of her position and stopped thinking about the actual rights and interests of individual homeowners. I also learned that sometimes being reasonable and polite isn't enough. When someone is determined to ignore your legitimate concerns, you have to be willing to enforce your rights in ways that get their attention. The towing company owner called me a few weeks after everything was settled to thank me for the business. "That was one of our biggest single-day jobs this year," he said. "If you ever have any more HOA trouble, just give us a call." I told him I hoped that wouldn't be necessary, but it was good to know the option was available. Looking back, I think the whole thing could have been avoided if President Miller had just listened when I first brought up the issue at the HOA meeting. A simple "sorry about the confusion, we'll move the signs" would have solved everything. Instead, she decided that community convenience was more important than property rights, and that individual homeowners shouldn't be allowed to object when the HOA decided to claim their land for community use. I gave them a very expensive lesson in how property law actually works. The towing fees alone came to several $1,000s. not counting the legal costs the HOA had to pay for their attorney and the settlement payment they made to me. Everyone in the neighborhood is much more reasonable now when it comes to respecting property boundaries and individual rights. The new board is careful to stay within their actual authority, and residents think twice before assuming they can use someone else's property just because it's convenient. They wanted a community parking lot. I showed them the difference between community property and private property. Sometimes the most effective way to teach someone about respect is to demonstrate the consequences of not showing it. The funny thing is, if they had just asked me nicely in the first place, I probably would have been willing to work out some kind of arrangement. But once they decided to just take my property without permission and then tried to fine me for objecting, it became a matter of principle. Now every time I pull into my driveway, I look at that little decorative fence marking my property line and remember that sometimes you have to stand up for what's yours, even when it's inconvenient for other people. And every time I see President Miller walking her dog past my house, looking anywhere except in my direction, I'm reminded that respect and authority aren't the same thing. Real authority comes from understanding and working within the actual rules, not from just deciding that your convenience matters more than other people's rights. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Hi all, your stories are so inspiring and I really think it is healing for me. So this is probably not a hugely malicious story, but I am a recovering people pleaser, so for me it is big. Context. In May of this year, I fell ill and had to go to a clinic for exhaustion, depression, and burnout symptoms. Before that, I had been quite closed off and had isolated myself, which is a normal behavior for my illness, I learned. This also meant I didn't check in with my friends or had to cancel plans last minute because I would get panic attacks if I went out. Of course I would make up stupid excuses because I was ashamed of myself. A close friend had planned to leave to travel for 6 months in May and wanted to meet me before that. I made up something why I couldn't come, feeling guilty for not showing up for her. Because we are Swiss, she never said anything, but she also never said goodbye on the day she left, which I totally understood. A few weeks into my clinic treatment, I decided to write to her and apologize for my behavior, explaining what my situation had been. She answered with asking me for book recommendations to read on her travels. She didn't ask how I was or acknowledged my apology, but I thought, well, she might still be a bit angry or disappointed. So I gave her a few books to read and wished her all the best for her journey. Sadly, since then, my friend has never asked about how I have been or sent just a little hello. She was MIA for several months. I was a little disappointed, but I had also learned in therapy that the aftermath of a breakdown can mean that you see who really are close friends and who aren't. I have been out of the clinic for a few weeks now, feeling so much better and actually thriving. Today, I got a message from my friend asking for more book recommendations. No hi, how are you? Do you feel better or anything? Just, hey Google, get me some good books. Not literally, just the tone. It made me giggle because it was so absurd, but then I thought, how do I react? Just giving her what she wanted seemed too people-pleasy, and not reacting seemed too passive-aggressive because I'm not bothered, I just don't give a insert here. So to finally get to the point, I know she hates horror or even slightly uncanny stories, so I recommended her books that are normal at the surface and end with a twist that makes you gasp or haunt you forever. I know it's not much, but I think I'm on a good path to not be a pushover anymore. Plus, I am really interested if she ever gets in touch with me again. The next one is an entitled people story. My husband and I own and operate a small contracting business, drainage work, etc. Our estimates are always free. We do not have employees and do all the work ourselves. This is all information we give prospective customers when they call us. Early this spring, a woman called us who had been referred to us by an acquaintance of ours. She was having some drainage issues that she thought was caused by a neighbor installing a concrete parking area. We told her we'd be happy to come take a look and give her an estimate. We showed up, spent a lot of time walking around, measuring, planning, etc. All the while, she was railing on her neighbor and talking non-stop about the lawsuit she'd filed against him. She told us her attorney had advised her to get some written quotes on how much it would cost to solve her drainage problems. Fine. We always provide written quotes on our letterhead. Of note, I was limping heavily, having recently broken some bones in my foot. I mentioned needing to sit soon because of it, and she asked some questions about it. I told her I was scheduled for surgery on X date to have things fixed. I sent her the quote the next day. Over the next few days, she sent several how much would this be emails for things that bordered on crazy. Even though it took me a lot of time and figuring for these extras, I happily obliged, as I always do. Fast forward 2 months, it was 3 days after my surgery, and we hadn't heard any more from her since the initial quote. We got a notification in the mail that my husband needs to come to the post office and pick up a restricted letter from an attorney. He had to take time out from doing absolutely everything around the house and in our business, I was completely non-weight-bearing, to go pick the letter up. It was a subpoena and a check for $35. Rather than call and ask us if we would testify about the drainage problems, she had her attorney subpoena us to be in court for 2 days. The $35 was state-mandated minimum compensation for 2 days in court plus mileage. I was in pain, and I was in no mood. I called her and, as politely as I could, asked WTF. She said she didn't know her attorney was going to subpoena us. I told her we would effectively have to close our business for 2 days to honor the subpoena. She had subpoenaed the wrong person anyway, since it was me who puts the estimates together, and I couldn't sit in court even if I wanted to because I had to keep my foot elevated and couldn't even drive since it was my right foot. She said I'd have to talk to her attorney. So I left a voicemail for the attorney and sent an email explaining the situation. After a few days of not hearing from the attorney, I called the formerly potential client back and told her she needed to intervene. I have no control over what my attorney does. I told her, you absolutely have control over what your attorney does. Afterwards, I sent another email to the attorney telling her we had nothing to contribute. We had revoked the estimate, and even if we did have something to contribute, she had subpoenaed the wrong person and I was physically unable to sit in court for 2 days. Furthermore, asking us to close our business and sit in court for 2 days for $35 would be a financial burden. The attorney finally responded to my email a week later, a few days before the court date, and asked when a good time would be to meet with me to go over what I would say in court. It wasn't my proudest moment when I responded with, "Do you have some sort of reading comprehension problem?" She finally released the subpoena after I told her she really didn't want the jury to hear what I had to say about the ridiculous lawsuit. Also, the neighbor had a counterclaim for defamation and her client wouldn't shut up about all the nefarious doings of her neighbor while we were there looking at her property. I told her if opposing counsel asked, I'd be honest about that. Out of curiosity, I looked at court records after the trial date had passed. Of course she lost her case. It made me smile when I saw that her neighbor had won their counterclaim for defamation. Anyway, thank you for watching.